Ao Mai Te Rā, as the dawn has come. It's a shift from just daybreak to acknowledging the sun coming, the rā, ao mai, coming to the space, and that being a metaphor, an analogy for us addressing anti-racism, that we've been in this space, te pō, of racism, of facing inequity and injustice within the health system, and the dawn of the sun of a new day is a time where we can experience newness, and that's living in an anti-racist society, experiencing an anti-racist health system. And so Ao Mai Te Rā is about all of that.
Raurangatira mā, tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, hara mai, ki tēnei kōnai ipurangi ko Ao Mai Te Rā te ingoa. Welcome to Ao Mai Te Rā. This is a podcast series about racism, where we explore racism, all its forms, how it manifests, and how we can get rid of it. With us today are a very special group. We have the project team from the kaupapa itself, Ao Mai Te Rā. It's such a privilege to have you with us today. Tell us a bit about who you each are, and then we'll get into the story of Ao Mai Te Rā.
Well, kia ora rā, ko Jacob McGregor tōku ingoa no ngā rauru, rau kaua tau ki te tonga me te whānāpuni. Jacob McGregor, I work as a Principal Advisor Engagement at the Ministry of Health, and I support Ao Mai Te Rā alongside my colleagues here as the Comms and Engagement Lead.
Tēnā koe.
Kia ora.
Kia ora, he uria hau no te raroa me Ngāti Apakura me Pitcairn Islander hau, ko Kiri Dāgawu tōku ingoa. I'm the Principal Advisor Equity. I sit in the Māori Health Policy team in the Māori Health Directorate as one of the co-leads for Ao Mai Te Rā.
Tēnā koe.
Tēnā koe. Ko Sam Austin tōku ingoa no Ngāti Raukawa me Ngāti Hinerangi o. Sam Austin, I'm a Senior Policy Analyst in the Māori Health Directorate Strategy and Policy team, the co-lead for Ao Mai Te Rā, working alongside my colleagues here, originally from Rotorua.
Tēnā koe, nau mai. Wow, so I'm super keen to hear about how this kaupapa came to be. So who wants to start? Where were some of the key landmarks when there was a synergy and this kaupapa was born?
So I think just in harking back to the name Ao Mai Te Rā, it has quite significance behind it, but I'll let Jacob tell the story behind that. But I think in recognising racism within the public service specifically, or in a public service specifically, the kaupapa itself is a tip of the hat to Ao Te Rā, which was I think it's 1980, mid-1980s report into racism in the public service. So quite fittingly, Jacob gifted this kaupapa with the name Ao Mai Te Rā, which speaks to...
Yeah, I think if Puao Te Atatu is the daybreak and Ao Mai Te Rā as the dawn has come, it's a shift from just daybreak to acknowledging the sun coming, the rā, ao mai, coming to the space, and that being a metaphor, an analogy for us addressing anti-racism, that we've been in this space, te pō, of racism, of facing inequity and injustice within the health system, and the dawn of the sun of a new day is a time where we can experience newness, and that's living in an anti-racist society, experiencing an anti-racist health system. And so Ao Mai Te Rā is about all of that, and its whakapapa is really rooted in the hapori. It's rooted within our people, it's rooted within the voices of our community and what they demanded or expected of us in the Ministry of Health through a series of engagements. And Sam will know more about that. With Whakamaua, the Māori Health Action Plan, people said that we want to experience an anti-racist health system, or a health system in which we don't experience racism. And so it's really rooted in that aspiration, or that wawata that our communities had. And so we took that, and this is the hua, one of the hua, at least one of the outcomes that's come out of that corridor. Is that right?
Oh yeah, I just think so. Ao Mai Te Rā, and thinking back to Puao Te Atatu, is the idea that whānau and Māori have been asking to address racism at a systemic level for a long time now. So it's nearly 40 years ago we're talking about that we had Puao Te Atatu first released, and we're still asking for it. So I think having Ao Mai Te Rā linking to Puao Te Atatu is the idea that we've been asking for this for a long time, and because of the ebbs and flows of what we can and can't do, through different political landscapes and the different focuses, it's important now that we acknowledge where we have come from or where it was first done, and that it's been a consistent whānau aspiration regardless of how the kōrero has been sort of in the government. So this is why we started up again as Ao Mai Te Rā, so that we could acknowledge the whakapapa of racism and that it has been deeply embedded in our system. And it's time now that whānau are wanting us to address it, and we are willing to sort of go on that journey.
So the ministry made a commitment in 2020. Actually, the first commitment was in 2019 and then later in 2020, where there are 3 key strategic documents that the ministry has now that have outcomes or goals to address racism and discrimination in all its forms in the health and disability system. And so that goal or outcome is reflected in Whakamaua, the Māori Health Action Plan. It's reflected in Ola Manuia, the Pacific Wellbeing Plan, and also in the New Zealand Cancer Control Plan as well. So, and linking back, you know, looking back on where we've come from and where we're heading to, it is very much about acknowledging that there is a lot of evidence around the presence of racism in the health and disability system, and that health alongside education has some of the strongest evidence bases, both domestically as well as internationally. So for us, Ao Mai Te Rā was very much about not being a kaupapa that's centred around the question of is racism an issue in the health and disability system, because it's already been addressed, it's already well evidenced. It's very much about it's present, what are we going to do about it? And so in talking about that transition between Puao Te Atatu and Ao Mai Te Rā, it is acknowledging that the sun it's come now, the dawn has come. It's time for us to do something about this persistent issue that we haven't been able to address for quite some time.
I think Ao Mai Te Rā's action-oriented is a really big thing, is linking to that. It's not about acknowledging it, it's about doing something about it. You know, it's about the fact that racism is embedded and creates illness, you know, and we talk about health inequities, quite a jargon term, I think, but it's illness. It is a lack of wellness for whānau Māori, people of colour in general, you know, in the system. So it's important that we're actually moving to do something about it now and not just considering it, because on top of the empirical or Western-based evidence, we just have the lived experience of whānau who tell us, you know, who say that these are the experiences they have, and it's in our whānau, and it's, you know, it'll be in your whānau where we see it. And I think we have a privilege of being able to talk about it, and we have a privilege of being able to operate in a Western system in a way that suits it, sort of thing, but not everyone does. So it's using that privilege to have those conversations.
Kia ora. And so shining that light of that new day, that's a really powerful metaphor, isn't it? As you say, a very fitting one. And I wondered if you wanted to share some of the experiences, the lived experiences that we all have from your lives that give you the impetus, the energy, the inspiration to do the work you do, because bringing these kaupapa forward is not easy, and we face a lot of challenges, and staying true to the kaupapa is hard. So does anyone want to talk maybe about your early life experiences around racism?
I was just going to say, we had a conversation last night, and it was specifically around Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and it was specifically also about colonisation, the impacts of colonisation. So I think for me, it wasn't necessarily, it's not necessarily rooted in an experience where I have been a victim of racism or racist abuse. It's more around the fact that it wasn't until I got to university that I started to learn about this thing called colonisation, where I started to learn about this thing called power, the unequal distribution of resources and what that meant in terms of health outcomes and so forth. And for me, it's my desire to be able to do something about this is very much harking back to that point in time where I realised, oh my gosh, like how is it that I've only just learnt about this, and I'm almost at that stage, 18 years, and I'm only just learning about this thing called colonisation. And how is it that I'm only just learning that unfair treatment, or the treatment that my whānau have received in primary care, that's actually unfair. Because I think in some respects you don't necessarily see it as being unfair until you realise the level of treatment that other people get. Yeah, and it's not until you have that dialogue that you realise, oh, actually there's some differential treatment going on here, and actually unpicking some of that. But for a very long time, when I look back on that, it's like you become, if you're not acutely aware of those structures, then you just assume that that's normal. Yeah.
I like that the lack of awareness of what's normal for other people, not having grandparents thinking that that's normal for to not live with my karaua, and not have them around me, to have uncles die in their 60s, and for that to be a normal experience right across my generation, and being aware now that they died from preventable diseases or from mate, from sickness that could have been prevented if they were given appropriate health care. Having my mum, whose heart is much older than she actually is, and having those illnesses passed down through our whakapapa as well, the fact that our whakapapa is not just pepeha, maunga and awa, now we have mate and maremare and rewharewa and other things that have been passed down that we've inherited, and not because we wanted to pass them down. It's a result of injustice, of colonisation, of a system that's been created that doesn't serve us, a system that doesn't work for us, a system which would go to the hospital and not be afforded the proper care or not given the proper care, or for our symptoms to not be taken as seriously. To see that with my mother, myself, when I go to the doctor, to feel like I can't share as much about myself or how I want to receive care because I don't think that my mātauranga or my whakaaro is going to be taken as serious by the doctor who's seeing me. So all of these things, being aware of them, or at least aware that that's not really fair, but not really aware that that's actually just straight up racist until we get to university, like having that sort of our own dawn coming within our brains or our mind of Ao Mai Te Rā, I roto i a hau, that this isn't right, and having that fuel, I think each of us individually and now collectively as well, where we have to shift from kōrero to mahi, from being in a place of rest within te pō to a place of actually working under the sun, because if we don't, these things will continue to happen, and that whakapapa that I've inherited of sickness and disease will be passed down through the generations that will come through me as well. So all of those things are personal experience, lived experience, that have shaped how I operate, how we all operate, and how we'll do this mahi and make sure that something comes of it.
I mean, I think all of that's relatable. We talk about this quite a lot through work, that the mahi we do is obviously just stressful because it's mahi, but it's also stressful because it means so much to you. And personally, the things you do, if I have a slower day, I do go home and I think about, like, you know what, if I failed my job, or if I failed family, if I failed to deliver, something for better for my whānau. And I think I'm lucky because I've got the privilege, I've got a Pākehā father, which means that first of all I can navigate a Pākehā world much easier, sort of thing, and which includes going to the doctors and having those conversations. But I've seen in my wider whānau Māori, and then just obviously being from Rotorua, that not everyone has that privilege of understanding that, and the intergenerational trauma that has come down from my kuia, who was quite abused and wasn't treated well by the health system, and seeing that passed into some of her daughters, and how that passes down into our generation, and the constant transference of trauma and mistrust of the system, and having to break that down. And I have the privilege of being able to break that down for myself, but wanting to share that with my wider whānau, and seeing that they go in to get asthma treatment and the doctors immediately ask them why they're here for meth drugs, or why they, what do they need, and that I never experienced, but I see it, and it's not good enough, and it's just, it makes you so much more impassioned and enraged against the system, and gives you that drive to look into this from not just this is a theoretical issue, but this is causing illness in my whānau, and this is causing illness across the board of tangata Māori.
Kia ora. I think that is at the crux of this new dawn of action, is drawing on the grief and the loss and the pain, because it's a life and death issue for our whānau. Racism is not this idea that exists in a book. For us, it's a very real daily threat to our well-being, threat to our whakapapa, as you've said. So, I'm a psychiatrist, I'm interested in well-being, and so I'm interested in how you've looked after yourselves while you hold this precious taonga through to this point of it really coming to life and starting to have its own mahi. In my mahi, we talk a lot about the grief that Māori doctors hold because of what it means to us. So do you have some thoughts about that for other Māori working in the public sector, working with the same aspirations that you do? What have you learned about how you keep yourselves well?
I think, just going back to that point around the different hats that we wear. So while we have a duty as public servants to do what's best for all New Zealanders, at the same time we also have a duty to our whānau, our hapu and our iwi. And so as much as we would like to call this a job that is 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, no sooner you stepping out that door, you're still carrying the weight of, and I'm not going to call it a burden because I don't think it's a burden as such, but you do carry that weight of responsibility to be able to make sure that you're doing what's right for our people. And I don't think it's just specific to Māori public servants specifically. I know that some of our Pacific brothers and sisters who are in the public service have similar stories as well, and also carry similar responsibilities on behalf of their communities as well. In terms of what it means to keep ourselves safe and keep ourselves well in this space, I think leadership makes a really big difference. We are in this moment of time where we have a window of opportunity to call this thing what it's by its actual name, to call it racism. We're not talking about bias, we're not talking about prejudice or discrimination, we're talking specifically about racism. And I actually think that that's in some respects, it's a privilege to be able to be in a space where we can call it what it is, but also have the support of our senior leaders who are there to also lead out on the kaupapa, but to also start building a shared language around what this is, what it looks like, and what we will be calling it from now on. So I think the leadership makes a really big difference. We're also in a really unique position where within the Māori Health Directorate, we're 3 of probably 30 people in the directorate. So, and these guys may have other experiences, but for me personally, the ability to be able to go and have difficult and hard conversations on a day-to-day basis around how we improve access to services, the quality care, good quality care, and improve health outcomes for Māori. While we're having those conversations, to be able to come back to a unit that is essentially a safe haven, where you don't have to veil or filter your experiences. You can just call it what it is, and we can openly share what these things are and what our experiences are. Because 9 times out of 10, we're all walking that same journey. So
having a mahi whānau, I think, is just the biggest protective factor that you can have in that space. And not everyone has the luck of having it to absolutely recognise that there are isolated Māori and Pacific and people of colour that don't have the ability, but looking for that safe haven, that group that you can relate to, and you don't have to explain or even feel the fragility of having to discuss racism with someone who doesn't quite understand it is a really big thing. You can just come in honest, here's my 100% self and my 100% feelings that are not great today, and that's a lot of, that builds your resilience up, the shared resilience.
100%. Strengthen the collective in your whānau and your hapu, both within mahi, but also outside of mahi. And I think being really firm or resolute in who you are, knowing who you are and whose you are, having that identity or that tuakiri to back you up is really important. That when you go into a space, you know who you are, you know what you're talking about, and you're backed up by your tupuna or the people who are behind you. So it's easier for us because we are within a Māori Health Directorate. And ahakua haere kia, wherever we go, it doesn't really matter, because when we come back, we have this group that we can share that weight with, that weight that we're carrying when we go home. We have whānau, we have other people. I know it's really difficult for Māori who are working independently, but finding those connections across the sector is really important for health and well-being, but also just finding out who they really are and those connections back home. Going home has been so beneficial, going back to the water, going to the wai te whakanoa, going back to my marae or my people where I'm from has been such a recharge for me, and it's good to get outside of the building as well, outside of the sector, and to go back to just normal people who aren't institutionalized. So we're not saying that we are, but just going back to normal people who aren't accustomed or attuned to how we speak in public sector and all of these terms that we use, and just being real and authentic again, and picking up the tea towel or having a cup of tea with normal people is really awesome and encouraging, and helps us shift us out of this taumaha, and it's really difficult to just remind us that, yeah, it is difficult. There are a lot of things, but just be normal sometimes as well, and go home. I think it's really good. Go home, see your people.
Nā whakaroranga tira, te hoki mai ki te kāinga.
Ai.
Yes, there's so many rongoā, as you say. The tea towel is a great one. So this difficult journey, the word racism is one of the real kickers, isn't it? As you said, what do you guys think is so hard about even saying that word? Why was that word so hard to say, so awkward, so uncomfortable? What are your thoughts about that?
I think there's a concept, I'm trying to remember who the author is, I've briefly almost mentioned, but white fragility is a really big thing that I think has made it difficult to have a kōrero about racism. And I really want to reference the author now, but I can't.
Roman D'Angelo.
Yes, Roman D'Angelo, yeah, phenomenal. And the concept just being that often you explain to people of colour that they don't have the wording for it, but that feeling of discussing racism with someone who's unfamiliar, and you start to feel explaining it to them, you start to feel uncomfortable because you can feel that they feel uncomfortable. And I think talking about racism has made that fragility, or white fragility, come up, you know, and so you don't talk about it because you don't want to have to take that emotional labour on of someone who doesn't understand racism, and so it becomes a bit too taboo, you know, it becomes this sort of off topic that you can't quite address, and then there's also the political nuances around it as well, that's a reality that we live within, but that's again, having those people that you don't have to explain it to is really important, and then becoming grounded in your knowledge of it, so even when someone feels fragile or they're scared of it, you can hold your own because you know that in your mana, you don't have to explain it to them, you don't actually have to do that mahi, that work. You just need to know in yourself that this is how I understand racism to be. But I think that's why it's been so hard to address it, because it scares people. It scares people to feel that they might be a part of that system. But when we can all accept the reality that we are part of that system, it's actually a lot easier just to acknowledge it and work towards unpacking it.
The language of racism itself, it sits against that social and political, it sits against a backdrop of, the social and political climate of the day. And we've seen that evolve. Cultural safety is a really good example of how cultural safety and its various iterations and how it's conceptualized now has changed over time since Iri Hapiti coined it in the 80s. So, and even when you're looking at the evolution of cultural safety and how that has changed over time, it has been influenced by the social climate, the political climate. So there are a lot of different forces that kind of shape the way that the language that we use, and our point of reference for what racism means to us as both individuals, but how it's manifested institutionally and structurally as well.
And I think if racism's all about power, we've never really had the power as a people to speak to it, and the people who have held that power, i.e. white people, who control the social psyche or shape the way that we view things in society through media, through policy, te mea, they've created this environment in which it is an unsafe kōrero because of that lack of safety. They feel that fragility that comes up when you just mention it. And we were speaking about this earlier today, actually, Kitty and I, that we start to speak about these things about challenging racism and creating a new world in which there is a redistribution of power, in which there is an empowering of te iwi Māori or people who have been marginalised and BIPOC people right throughout society and across the system, there's this idea that a lot of Pākehā have that I'll lose something and that things will change. And because the system's been unfair for you, if there's a redistribution, there's a potential for me to be treated just as unfairly as I or my people have treated you. So I think when you start this kōrero about tackling racism, there are these what-ifs that come up for a lot of people, and without the appropriate context or understanding about what's actually created racism and the lack of power we've had, those fears come up. And there's that, I think also inherently as Māori, wanting to be all about manaakitanga and treating people fairly and being kind with one another, we often can be maybe a little bit too much manaakitanga with some of those people when we're like, I want to bring this up, oh, but you're getting a bit hurt feelings here, so I'm going to change the way I'm talking. When really just challenge it and say how it is, and it's not on us to manage how they're feeling. That's their problem and not an us problem.
I think that is an interesting cultural nuance, and I've heard that around different contexts, that the manaaki that is at the core of our culture and of our value system can kind of get in the way when we value that differently over other people's getting hurt feelings, as you say. So what are some of the hopes that you have for how Ao Mai Te Rā will be a radical game changer in Aotearoa?
So the podcast series actually sits alongside a work program, a broader work program. And this broader work program is looking at when we're talking about racism, you know, what would an Aotearoa New Zealand definition for racism be for the health and disability system, and what would the definition be for what good or effective anti-racism solutions be as well? Because I think in trying to develop a shared language around what this thing is, it does come back to having a shared definition of some sort. Yeah. So the work program that we're looking at, the first phase is a discovery phase. And what we're wanting to do out of that first phase is to create definitions around racism and effective anti-racism solutions and what they look like. To also look at the types of activities that are currently underway in the system at the moment. Because I think it's also important to acknowledge that when we talk about pro-equity, when we talk about anti-racism, that there are a number of different solutions or programs or courses or policies that sit under that banner of anti-racism. And so it's acknowledging all of those types of activities that have also been hard fought for. So for the likes of like Te Tiriti o Waitangi training, for instance, you know, while it might not be the thing that creates a significant change overnight, it's an important part of that journey for anti-racism. So it's acknowledging those types of activities that have been hard fought for over the last 30 to 40 years, understanding what's in the system at the moment, and looking at what it is that we should be doing moving forward based on either good or best practice evidence, both nationally and internationally. So what we're aiming to do is that once we've got a better line of sight around how we should be going about addressing racism, we should have a better idea of the types of new solutions that need to be developed for phase 2. So it's a 2-phase program. Okay. But it is very much a program that I think will need continual dialogue. It needs a long-term commitment to change as well. Realistically, as much as we do want this to transform the system overnight, there is a journey that we have to go on as a nation and as a health system to be able to unpick those structures that are maintaining and perpetuating racism and inequity in our system as well.
Yeah. I think in terms of what you were just saying there, it's the journey of Aotearoa. It's not just the health and disability system. And I think so. There's this kōrero, the other kōrero that will be had around this. A big part of that is is lifting up the discussion of racism and just getting people, because as much as the health and disability system or the Ministry of Health changes, it needs to be matched by a general social attitude change, you know, which we are seeing happening all the time, but we need to elevate the discussion around racism. And this is quite a complex discussion that we have, but we need to make that more normalized so everyone can understand the nuances of racism, and it's a more commonplace understanding that, hey, racism is really complex and insidious and in systems and invisible at times. And once we can sort of bring that up, like this part of this communications aspect of the campaign, that will also help shift social attitudes. So a big part of it for me is trying to normalize outside of policies, outside of the government, how are people seeing racism? How are they feeling about racism? What's that human connection that people who have never had to think about it, all of a sudden they're thinking about it, you know, and what's the human connection they can create to the kaupapa and how they can see themselves as part of it.
I think there's a point in there too around the need to build collective responsibility for addressing racism as well. It's not just an issue that needs to be addressed by Māori or by Pacifica whānau as well, but actually it's going to take all of us to be able to collectively address this and take responsibility for it.
100%. I think sitting alongside all of that, because what I see is a couple of paitata towards the big paitawhiti, that distant horizon being an anti-racist Aotearoa, and within that an anti-racist health system, and saying anti-racist, not just absence of racism, a system that actively rids itself of racism every time something pops up, actively rids itself of that kaikiritanga every time someone experiences it within the system. And the two paitata that Kitty spoke to was firstly identifying what the problem with the mate is, and then secondly identifying the solution or the treatment to that issue, understanding that in order to rid this country of this really significant issue, we have to get to the root of it, and we have to work out what solutions there are. And alongside all of that are these communications, are things like this podcast, this kōrero, these vehicles, these vessels that can be used to bring this kōrero to te motu whānui. And going back to what Te Puia said, mehe mea ka moi moi ahau anake, ko au anake. If I dream alone, it'll just be me, but if we collectively dream together, if we build that collective responsibility and sow those kākano through channels like this, throughout the entire health sector, throughout the entire country, if we sow that dream within everyone that we can have an anti-racist Aotearoa, we can have an Aotearoa in which there doesn't have to be unequal distributions of power. Māori can experience mana motuhake and tino rangatiratanga in a way that doesn't take from others, but it empowers everyone and enables everyone, that we can experience a health system in which I can go and speak my reo and speak freely about who I am and have services delivered to me in a way that will work to me and my whānau, where my whānau can live well into their hundreds, if not 200s, because we're coming to the future whānau. If it's something like that, I think if we can sow those dreams, really audacious goals, then I think we can begin to shift the kōrero around what Kitty was saying from, is racism here, to how do we get rid of it, and how do we move from where we are towards that paitawhiti, that distant horizon that we want to get towards. I think that's the hua that we want to get out of this.
Ka pai. E ngā manu taiko te kaupapa whakahirahira nei. Nei a mihi karere ki a koutou katoa. Kia ora guys, thanks for listening, thanks for watching. I'm sure you found some very thought-provoking ideas in our kōrero today. If you want to know more about this kaupapa, have a look at our website. Until next time, ka kite, mā te wā.